All right, so for this one, starting off with what is essentially a clash of irreconcilable cultures, perhaps, or two cultures very alien and distinct from one another. Ergo, let's take it to BattleTech, the clan invasion. You have the descendants of the SLDF separated by a period of...
First of all, we probably should explain to the audience because they're not.
Yeah, if they're right. So basically,
the Star League Defense Force.
Yeah, the Star League Defense Force. I'll take care of it. The Star League Defense Force was basically a kind of actual effective UN that was a multi-ethnic, multicultural, but united under the banner of basically, the General Alexander Kerensky. It was more of they were following him more than they were loyal to the idea of the Star League, you could argue. And after the civil war that ripped the Star League apart, he decided to take his war veterans and their vast stockpiles of warships, war machines, and incredibly highly trained personnel and leave human space, because the government that he had served was basically imploded, and the lesser powers of the human sphere were basically rising up to claw pieces out of what had once been, and of course try to assert their own supremacy. He led them out into the unknown regions towards the core, and there they were for a period of about 300 years before their descendants decided, fuck this, let's go back. Long story short. And essentially, they began an invasion, full-blown, and in that period of 300-year isolation of basically privation, they had developed a very militant, kind of conservative culture, I would say. Conservative in that, don't waste resources, don't do this, don't pursue frivolous things. They didn't have the economic and resource might of the inner sphere. And they collided very violently with the inner sphere elements in an attempt to take what they saw as what they were the inheritors to, which was the Star Leagues. They were trying to reach Terra and reestablish this league and set up basically rule over the inner sphere. But they were so alien to their, shall we say, cousins, that it created an incredible clash of culture and conflict with it, especially when trying to administer occupied worlds. Ergo, the different levels of intensity of guerrilla warfare. Is there...
Well, in terms of the clans versus the inner sphere, right? I always take a slightly Huntingtonian view of these sorts of foreign policy questions. If you have an entirely separate thing, right, which is if you consider clan culture as a completely separate and differentiated civilization to whatever the inner sphere's nations were like. Obviously, the inner sphere themselves are different based upon actual modern human cultures, like you have
House
Kurita,
shameful display.
Yeah, which is obviously a samurai Japanese culture, and then you have the House Steiner, who's your German aristocrats, and House Merrick, who's your American hyper-capitalist nation, republic.
And then the filthy Capellans, who are,
House Liao Capellans, who are filthy, disgusting communists. And of course, this is very much analogous to international relations as it existed in the 1980s, right? But it's important to remember in terms of civilizational conflict, right? When you have civilizational borders, peace is possible, but it's very short-lived, and conflict is more the norm than peace in these areas where you have a literal civilizational boundary line. Right, it's just these things are always going to flare up. Peace is never going to be. Peace is never an option.
Peace was never an option.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
But the interesting thing about this is, and especially because in battles like the Major Lesson of the Klan invasion, the first time, which was defeated.
The first wave.
Yeah, the first wave, which is defeated at the Battle of Turkina, is.
Tukid.
Yeah, sorry, not Turkina.
Turkina is the mech.
Yeah, Turkina is my assault mech, but yes. Yeah, the Battle of Tukayed, which is the difference that you have between clan cultures. It's much more of a martial, honor-based culture, which has a very clear hierarchical caste system.
Very clear rules of engagement.
Yes.
When a battle is done, it is
done.
bargained and done.
Yes.
And it ends, and you can start shit over another thing down the road if you want to get back at them. You know, there's always, excuse you.
Yeah.
There's always a chance to prove that, oh, you beat us this time, but we'll take it to you, but the battle will end. It's not this dragged out guerrilla process.
Well, I would say total warfare does not exist in clan society. It cannot. And the very reason for this is because you have the idea of bondsmen, which is an incentive against just mass murdering your enemy clan's civilian population.
Yes.
Or even mass murdering captured prisoners or treating them poorly because, there's an incentive now to take warriors from other clans
or
and
civilians,
fold them, and fold them into
ranks.
My ranks as a bondsman, which is basically a slave. But however, bondsmen do have very specific privileges in that if they prove themselves, they are allowed, at least in the warrior caste, to rise out of the rank of simple bondsmen and to become a member of the actual clan itself, and even, indeed, to actually lead the clan.
Yes, there were several cases where some bondsmen did rise, but that also varied depending on the clan, because some clans did basically treat their bondsmen as slaves.
Yes,
and
that's a distinction. I'm not sure if that's
depending on this. Yeah, depending on the specific things. But as if I recall my history of it correctly, the clan societies that did not foment that kind of integration of bondsmen, also who participated in the invasion, had a lot of trouble with their civilian population who were now conquered and said, "Oh, what are you fucking talking about? We're citizens of, the Combine or the Roshalhagi Republic or, the Lyran Commonwealth, and fuck you, we're not your slaves." And this was, if I believe correctly, the biggest problem that the Smoke Jaguar clan had with the invasion of the Draconis space was just the inability to get the population to basically come to heel. And there was constant terrorism and guerrilla warfare on many of the worlds that they conquered. The inverse of that, in the most striking effect, was the Ghost Bear clan. The Ghost Bears were so, not necessarily hands-off, but their approach was much more diplomatic, to the point where they left much of the conquered Roshalhagi government intact, which eventually even led to basically the Ghost Bears rather than absorbing the Rosh Hagis, effectively going native, and within a century of relocating their pretty much their entire population and society to the inner sphere, viewing it as a preferential to simply staying in their home space that they had called home for 300 years, rather than we're going to return to the fold of humanity and its space. They basically went native, and the Rosh Hag Republic, which had just gained its independence and then been devoured by the vanguard of the clan invasion, effectively was reborn within a century as the Rosh Hag Dominion, and the even though they retained, a kind of, well, the clanners are part of us and integrated with us, there was this very strange fusion.
Very strange synthesis. Yeah, that's an interesting case, and that is the obvious solution to taking over a extremely hostile population who is like just totally different on every possible level from you, is that you're unfortunately going to have a style of syncretism. The problem of the doctrinaire clans, like Smoke Jaguar, is
our way is perfect, immutable, and superior, and it will not alter. We talked in our first video about how they were determined to hold the line with only their warrior caste, even when they had volunteers that were willing to stand up and fight to the invasion of Huntress. They said, no, our elites, our people, our inner group preferred elite that are in charge of everything are going to take care of everything. You just get out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are kind of a sort of Machiavellian analyses, right? Of, okay, well, if you take over somebody through military force who is totally different in every way in your society, there are certain concessions that you're going to have to grant. You can do the syncretism option, which is the ghost bears. That's a huge problem for your own society because, like we said with the Raja Hog Dominion, you can be changed basically from within. If you are a hostile ruling elite class, if like the possibility of you going native, your people will eventually marry the native women in a generation or two or three. Eventually, if you're a minority in that society, your genetic contribution will be overwhelmed and subsumed. Yes, the language might be yours, or like with the case of the English post Hastings, like you'll have the very specific hierarchy of language in terms of, okay, the French words or the Latin words are all high words, and the Anglo-Saxon English words are below. You'll have similar dynamics to these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at the situation south of the border where you have the Spanish, that conquered, all of Mexico and Central America and parts of, South America. You have still to this day, and it's not talked about because it's not part of the normal American, lexicanum, but you do have deep ethnic divides there still to this day between, those who are more Spanish, those who are kind of in the middle, and then the native populations.
Yes.
And there's a lot of conflict as a result of that. A lot of my coworkers talk when we get to just talking. They make very interesting observations, and it's also an interesting thing with talking about like our current situation in the United States today. It's almost like whatever we had to maybe keep a lid on those kinds of things has obviously fallen apart as the hierarchy of the society has started to shift, especially with the celebration of, victim groups as the highest, moral group in the society.
Yeah, but on the hunt, so from the Machiavellian and also a Huntingtonian lens, I mean, that sort of clan conquest is a huge deal because also when you have civilizational differences, peace does not last, like we've said. So, and obviously post Battle of Tukayed, it did not last. And once basically the time limit, that was
50-year truce,
the agreed upon time limit expired, conflict basically resumed immediately.
It even erupted. It even erupted even sooner, although they officially honored the agreement.
Right. It's that's more of like I know that the conflict is going to happen again. I know that the agreed upon time limit is expiring, and so I'm going to jockey for position and advantage
Right.
in whatever small way I can.
Right. And even then, as the point was made by Tex in his own work, Folkt was not, his goal was not to actually,
Sorry, that's Anastasius.
Anastasius
Right.
Folkt, yes, the general who won the Battle of Tukid. His goal was not to actually necessarily defeat them, even if he did.
I mean, sorry, you need to explain these things for the audience.
Okay.
He was on.
Yeah, he was the leader
forces.
of the Comm Guard who had challenged the clans to basically, if you beat us in this honorable engagement, we will give you Terra. We will give you what you want, the seat of the Star League. We will give you Terra. If we win, you will obey the 15-year truce. Now the question is, you gave the enemy exactly what they wanted if they won, and you only stalled for time. Now the question is obviously why? Well, the answer is he knew that within 15 years, the other states of the Inner Sphere are going to have revamped and rearmed so heavily
to deal with the new threat.
deal with the new threat that
and they needed the time to do that because the clan technology is so superior. So they need to, when you have superior technology, you need to develop new technologies of your own, develop tactics from those ones, or using the existing tech base that you have, develop tactics against your enemy tech
strategies, develop supply lines, develop the industry to churn out the numbers to counter your enemy's superior technology.
Yes, and that was basically how the Inner Sphere won the Battle of Tukid, along with a massive exploitation of the clan honor code in its utilization of honor duels. That's another interesting point I think that we've touched on before, which is that the clan utilization of honor duels
or honorable combat more than honor duels, but a religious notion. I believe it was the first time we talked about it was the religious notion or cultural, religious, philosophical notion blinded them and said this is the way it's supposed to be, this is the way it's done. They could not think outside the box. They refused to look outside the box.
Yes,
most of them.
But it's for their perspective, that is a good thing, because if you have a consistently honor culture like we said, it's well bargained and done. Conflict is now over. There's nothing more to be said.
There's no more collateral damage. There's no more unnecessary bloodshed and death.
Yes. And even though there's animosity, right? The conflict has been decided, and this is taking the idea of the heroic champion idea to a sort of logical extreme, where yes, you can fight honor duels based off of singular individuals or small groups of fighters that decide the fate of the larger group, and you use this idea of champions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course there's still individual honor duels and things like that in clan society for things like acquisition of resources or a new mech or
promotions
and
stuff
or things like that, or even like blood names, which is such a central part of clan culture. So what all of these things do, right, is the acquisition of bondsmen, the utilization of honor culture, and the utilization of bargaining, right? Because in clan honor or clan combat, which is just a slightly ritualized format of an honor duel, he who actually bids a smaller force is considered more honorable.
Because he achieves more with less.
Yes, because he achieves more with less. And what these three factors do is to take armed conflict and reduce them in scale, maybe increase them in intensity in and amongst the warriors themselves.
Yes, the clan, in pretty much most clan engagements, they, especially clan on clan, but also clan versus Inner Sphere, They were incredibly rapid, incredibly brutal, displays of martial prowess, from infantry to aerospace assets, everything
Yes.
was just this short, high-intensity struggle, usually catastrophic either for one or both sides. But again, the escalation did not spill over and start annihilating.
Yes,
the
violence is entirely contained within the warrior caste. It does not spill out into the broader society, except
in like
acquisition
wars
of
of
bondsmen,
well,
things like that.
well,
or wars of
bondsmen were usually in the battlefield taken, of course, once an enemy machine was
right,
down.
but that's a very small spillover, right? It's
Right.
a very and it's almost like, new boss, same as the old boss, almost, right?
Yes.
For most cases in clan society, not all, but for most of them, so this is a very powerful thing, because it means that if there is violence in the society, your society still retains violence, but there is not this sort of in our current society which is viewed as violence, and especially warfare, is viewed as an extremely negative thing that impacts the entire society from top to bottom. It's not a total war like the inner sphere tends to participate in, where these wars just drag on and on and on.
For in one case like 130, 150 years, the Third Secession War.
And to the point where actually you are fighting so much and so often, and the fighting is so ferocious that you actually, for example, after the Succession Wars, you physically reduce your technical capacity and your industrial capacity, because you just lose your technology.
Yeah, and because of the approach of total war, it just that's what I was going to say is the clanner method of warfare is a means of controlling escalation. The inner sphere, despite their we promise with this the Ares Convention, we won't use nukes most of the time.
Right.
It's still devolved into total warfare.
Yes.
That
and it's still
demolished immense amounts of technological progress.
Yes, it's the alternate scenario of what happens if you don't have nukes. If you have a tacit thing where nobody uses nuclear weapons and everybody agrees that they're not going to use nuclear weapons, right? The answer is, I'm still capable of using conventional conflict to do my thing, and I'm still able to use mass warfare, which I think, and I actually like this topic a lot, because this is a partial solution, and it's a return to the idea of the champion. And we've seen this before in things like the movie Troy, where you have the two champions facing off.
Which was a thing that they did back in the
Yes.
day. They would select
Yes.
champions and fight.
There's a book called Of Arms and Men, and it's really awesome because it takes this idea of ritualistic warfare, like you see between more medieval knightly combat, and of course this idea of the champion between two armies. These are forms of warfare that are essentially between equals, and these forms of warfare are only possible if everybody agrees that they're part of the same society, basically the same civilization.
Right.
These are not things that are going to be allowed when you have an entirely different group. Right.
Right. Like the Mongols invading, Europe would have been like, "Are you joking? No. We might send a guy out there to just kill your guy and, prove we're better, but then we're just going to end up slaughtering your army anyway."
Right. Well, I mean, this is, and I'm talking about the ritualistic forms, because the knightly tradition is similar, because it has a chivalric tradition.
Right. Yeah. It's a specifically European thing.
Yes.
Yes.
It is a specific martial code of conduct, which is there to help prevent larger conflict escalation. So, these sorts of forms do have a tendency to reoccur, and they almost seem perennial in a way. The other issue that I see is the inverse of that, of the sort of Ritual combat is predatory conflict, which is literally you have two completely opposing societies, and literally every tactic that under the sun is going to be able to be morally justified because they are so different. They are a different civilization. They are the absolute other, and therefore because empathy largely is, partially determined by in-group lines, and by largely genetic lines to a certain extent. So as well as like the cultural and religious lines also, but like culture and religion specifically is a shorthand for ethnicity anyway. So these things do have a tendency to be very highly intensive. And like the inner sphere, ironically, is it has its own, like BattleTech is a very odd universe because you have the Ares convention, and to me it almost like kind of doesn't make sense, and it given how nukes actually work, it is totally backwards to how the modern form of nuclear weapons takes. So it's kind of an anachronism in a way.
Well, you must remember that in the fiction, and this is a question too about what would happen, is that the solution, as you had so many worlds, so much territory, what does it matter if you glass one or two of them? What does it matter? You just denied it to the enemy. They're not gonna. They'll get a scorched out rock, or you drop nukes on an enemy position. You've got an entire world down there, and you've got hundreds of worlds. What's one nuke gonna do? What's one orbital strike gonna do? It's more of like simply what I perceive it to be is simply the scale, and you know how it's like the further removed you are from the situation, the more simply calculating it becomes. It becomes numbers. It doesn't become personal. It's just simply a calculus that you have. And it's like, okay, well, if I glass 3 worlds, you're not glassing the entire planet. You're just hitting an army drop there. Just drop a nuke on it. Yeah, you'll wipe out a battalion, and
urban center and industrial centers, etc.
Yeah, and it's not like the whole rest of the planet's habitable. One nuke, okay, some radiation will blow through a certain area, but it'll be gone in 50 years, 100 years, whatever.
Right.
It becomes that calculus. But what happens when everyone's doing it all the time?
Yes.
It's basically escalation going out of control. When the first response to you and what army is a nuke to the face.
Yes, that's too much.
Yeah.
But BattleTech is odd because like it basically it failed to, as an art form, predict the way that modern warfare is going to go. It couldn't predict that, like, with the nuclear threat looming still large on every single nation, and the lack of will to engage in mass armed conflict, like European nations did of old. Well,
but that's also.
Let me finish my point. So it means that BattleTech, like, yes, there is still espionage in the universe, but it didn't delve into, and there's still cyber warfare and shit. It kind of has a bit of that because it's like 80s tech base.
Right.
But it's still it doesn't quite understand the role of espionage and of intelligence operations, etc., etc.
Well, I would disagree on that.
War has taken.
They don't effectively. They don't have the internet, which makes things very interesting with how they do everything. But espionage is actually very extensive.
Right, but it's not.
It's human intelligence. Yeah, it's not computer intelligence.
Yeah, it's not OSINT. It's still very much of a Cold War era intelligence collection capacity.
Right. Well, and I mean that's one of the things with the revolution, is that no one could have, I think, properly, fully predicted how the internet changed everything. Not even the people who still today want to use it, to control basically everything. The genie's out of the bottle in many, many ways.
Right. So that's one aspect of BattleTech that didn't really hold up in time, but it's very interesting, right? How you deal with it, and of course, like actually having it's also kind of utopian in a liberal way because their version of NATO, the Star League, actually works in universe,
Well,
and it's just mostly toothless.
But the difference is that also, and one of the reasons it worked though, is because it was a kind of political check against the whole reason the various states participated in the league was very specifically to check the others' power. Basically, it was basically saying you're not allowed to pull shenanigans because I'm not allowed to pull shenanigans, and that is the only thing that kept it working.
Yes.
That was the only thing. And the moment it was gone and shenanigans started, everyone, but they already had their armies standing, they had their navy standing, and they had their WMD stockpiles ready to go the moment it dropped.
That's an interesting question for you because this is an area of war I have not thoroughly explored yet. And that is, what exactly was the size of the Star League Defense Force compared to the House militaries? Because all of the, House Steiner in not the Federated Sons, what is it? The Lyran Space.
Lyran Commonwealth.
Lyran Commonwealth, and then you have House Karita in the Draconis Combine, and then you have House Americ in the Merrick Commonwealth, and of course the Federated Sons down in their space.
Right.
So in all of these areas, what was the size of the military for the SLDF compared to all of the House militaries?
I believe the SLDF forces did outnumber, but that's because the houses seconded basically regiments to SLDF command as part of the agreement, and these forces were folded in and basically, taken away off the board from their parent nation.
Yeah.
And put actually into, in many cases, quote unquote, enemy or other space. But basically, they were not there to be like watchdogs. They were basically like, you just garrison here, you do your patrols, you do your drills, and blah, blah, blah. You hunt some pirates, The great houses are like, okay, yeah, we'll play this game. We don't need to be shooting at each other. Times are good right now. Technology's flourishing. Standards of living. So it's one of those situations where, everyone is relatively prosperous and no one side is getting too far ahead. Mm-hmm. That basically it's like, okay, we can agree, to kind of the system is working. It's like basically in a certain way you could think of it as like how the EU functioned for a bit, but as what has happened, the powers that be are starting to realize, oh, this deal's not working out. And that's one of the things that I think fiction a lot of times gets wrong, is that they presume that things are more stable than in reality they actually are. Because you can look at an example like the EU has been a terrible deal for many a European nation, and look at the uselessness of the United Nations in actually preventing conflict.
I mean that's just 1980s liberalism, and BattleTech certainly in its cartoony glory, 80s Saturday cartoony glory. It does take on the left wing vision of diversity, circa 1982, right? Which is, we're going to have the black guy. Of course, there's still the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy might be the bad guy technically, but there is a more brunette white guy who's the good guy, who's still very macho. Everybody's still very macho.
Oh yeah, it's the 80s. It's the 80s. The men are he-men, and
yes, and the women are like busty and svelte and just
but a lot of the at least in the lore wise, in the military way, it is that 80s kind of cliche of okay, the women can do it too, kind of thing.
Right.
But I mean, in a certain sense, though, when you have some of the technology of this universe at your disposal, a single pilot behind a single war machine can level a city block. So it's not necessarily the physical tolling, grind of infantry, and combined arms, ground tactics.
Right. And the other thing too on the diversity front is, of course, you have to have the Hispanic representation. You have to have the Asian person, which I mean, even the Draconis Combine, right? They obviously the Saturday morning cartoon that we watched had the Draconis Combine guy.
It's just a completely cliche Japanese.
Yes, Japanese Ma'honor.
Yeah, Ma'honor, Mabushido. Yeah.
And then of course,
the most egregious stereotype you could possibly imagine.
Yes.
But that's the funny thing is because and this is an interesting thing about the lore, which actually is interesting, is how you could hold together such a vast empire. It is like the reason they're like that is because that is the cultural enforcement. That is how the Draconis Combine achieved cultural hegemony, is by basically, we don't give a shit what your race is or your gender is, but we have this culture and you will conform to it, and if you don't, we're going to have problems.
Yeah, and it's almost, it is interesting, right, because the SLDF and the Star League basically fell apart. So it's very much kind of almost saying like, well, this sort of universalistic secular imperium that's going to be have multicultural diversity. It's very much a vision of its time, because at the time in the late 70s and early 80s,
the end of history and stuff was approaching.
Yeah, just prior to the Soviet collapse. I mean, this was what the European was always kind of envisioned to be. And so, like, these visions are now, like, even in the universe of BattleTech, are breaking down. Even now, you're seeing these, supranational bodies being,
rising
declining.
to ascendancy.
Rising to ascend. They've already risen to ascendancy. They're
Right.
declining now because people are understanding what they mean, and they don't like it. And you cannot keep these things together except by force. And if you don't have a religion like, say, the Pope or say the Christian Church, who is able to say, okay, well, you'll have the secular sphere with your nation, and I will just rule the religious sphere. No, I need full spectrum dominance, culturally, politically, financially, everything.
Religiously, yes, everything. And that's actually one of the things, too, that is, it's funny, it's even, you go into things like Warhammer 40k, with at least the Horus heresy, where spreading of the secular imperial truth, which of course collapsed. You couldn't hold the empire together with that. In BattleTech, religion really doesn't play much of a role in terms of that. It's that very 80s, like, everything is in its little box. Like, your religion is just in this little box here, and we maybe make reference to it.
Yeah, but that's part of the 80s level diversity, right? Which is, we're going to have representation for everybody on camera, and there's going to at least be a vision of a supranational body among all these nations that is going to keep everybody from fighting and war. It's a very liberal utopian vision. They're and of course everybody's still going to have their culture, and you're still going to be ruled by your own set of political classes who's going to represent you and everything like that your culture is supposed to be as an avatar, and like all of these different forms obviously make sense, and this is a vision that was kind of sold to us, right? This is a very liberal 1980s vision of this is what it's all going to be like. And so that's fascinating to see that
it's a time capsule in a very interesting sense. But also, it's funny because all these time capsules, despite maybe they get the decay timetable a little too long term, even then there was the realization this stuff just doesn't last forever, you know, and especially as like you saw and this is an interesting case with the clans and whatever the future may hold for interstellar mankind, is what happens when you would have a group of people just split off and disappear for centuries and then come back. You know, I don't know how far they're going to go with the Dune movies, but that is one of the things in the later books. When Leto II is the God Emperor of Dune, humanity basically in chunks, part of it just scatters to flee his empire, and they disappear into infinite space, and eventually some of them start to come back, and it of course leads to intense conflict.
Yes.
And it's an interesting question of, and we'll probably never live to see it, but what will happen to these, you know, far-flung elements of humanity that are allowed to develop completely on their own. You know, like the world was very large once upon a time. Now the world is small with the airplane and the internet and the radio. And so basically you don't have anywhere to run to if you want to get the hell away from the powers that be, you know. But distance of the stars could allow that, but what avenue would people take? And I think the answer to that is, well, they'll want their independence, they'll want to do their own thing, and if you don't give them that ability to have that autonomy, you're going to have conflict. You know, it's like the comic where the Warhammer is standing over the civilian, is like, you are being liberated from darkness and backwardsness. Please do not resist.
Resistance is futile.
Yeah.
But this is interesting though, because like it's so many of the people in our sphere of things talk about how basically that's essentially what liberalism has become. And
I think that's it's always what its intention was. It talks in honeyed words about peace and love and everything, but at the end of the day, it's like it'll be peace and love on our terms.
There's an interesting conversation that I forget who was talking about this. Somebody in our sphere, I can't remember who, it's driving me nuts, but they're basically talking about empire, and especially the British Empire. It was not started by people who were, for the most part, very liberal, oh, we're going to get rid of slavery. No, it was very ethnocentric, like, I'm coming here to dominate this land, I'm claiming it for God and country. And later, once the empire started to actually, started to decline, that's when all of this, caring stuff happened. And this is the pathological empathy that we see among people is basically just an extension of the final phase of empire. So, I mean, these things are fascinating to talk about, and like, I don't know, BattleTech is just awesome for so many reasons, because like all good stories, they ultimately devolve into being reactionary. Like, speaking of the Harebrained Schemes game, we have talked about ad nauseum not on recording yet, but how the actual storyline of that BattleTech video game is actually reactionary in its nature.
Despite the fact that their Harebrained Schemes is a bunch of leftoids to the 9th degree, yes.
Yeah, despite themselves, despite the fact that, Lady Kamea Urano is, obviously a mystery meat brown woman with dark hair and dark eyes and olive skin, and of course every single character, most of them are black, In the video game itself, all of the characters that you can hire, most of
Yeah,
them are
you
black.
you literally cannot make a blonde-haired, blue-eyed character in that game.
I did.
Oh,
I think they
nice,
did
they
fix
edited?
that.
Well, yeah, but that's only because,
That's because people complained.
yeah, yeah, no, well, and that's the thing is I do not, it's the diversity thing doesn't bug me in the sense that they have it. It's that it's obvious, like just like everything, the blade of tolerance and everything else, the blade of diversity, the blade of this, that, only cuts one direction.
Yes, and that's intentional. That's just repressive tolerance in action. But it's interesting to see, like, and especially because I saw the first Wakanda film, I'm not going to see the second. I have to watch
Google searches for Wakanda and can I vacation there, spiking 10,000%.
I'll wait till the Lotus Eaters does their review on it because they do some good ones, and we'll see. But the interesting thing about like this harebrained schemes game is like the same thing as Wakanda, right? It's still very much a reactionary story. It's still very much a story of betrayal of an aristocrat, basically, whose purpose in life is the reclamation of their throne and their right to rule.
Yeah.
Which is essentially the same plot line as Dune, essentially.
Yes.
So
yeah, I mean, it's you could argue there's a bunch of rip-offs there, at least in the deeper plot elements, rather than the cartoony superhero stuff. I forget who did the analysis and breakdown, and he was saying, look, if you just made this country in Europe and made everyone here blonde hair, blue-eyed, and kept relatively, except for changing some of the aesthetics, this would be a film that Adolf Hitler would be praising. Like, he'd be so proud, a technologically and martially superior ethno-state ruled by an all-powerful leader. This is
what people want, and it's what. And to be honest, Wakanda is absolutely cope for the jogger population.
Oh yes.
Because they just can't accept that the white man actually is superior to you. Sorry, I said it.
No. Well, this.
I'm not sorry. Hashtag sorry, not sorry.
Not sorry. No. Well, but you see that's the thing too, and you see like the Chinese are going into Africa now, and they are having intense problems trying to get they're trying to build, for their brick and road and their own goals and ambitions for what they're building in the world for their multipolar and probably their dominance in the future. They are having a lot of problems trying, if they are at all trying to use the local population. A lot of times they will bring in just their own people because they just can't use the local population to get done what they need done, if they even want to. There's all kinds of schemes and the way they're using predatory,
Yeah, I don't have
stuff.
much to say on China and Africa, unfortunately. So I'm going to let that thread of the conversation.
Well, the point is that because you said about Wakanda is cope, all of the stuff that Europe left behind as it decolonized and left Africa, they've left to basically rot. There are bridges that were built by the Romans.
Yeah, I know. I've seen
them.
these.
And what happened? Some of them are still standing, a few of them, but the ones that are broken, these bridges were never repaired, never rebuilt, even though they would have been incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's the interesting part of any sort of a reactionary analysis of ultimately left-wing sources is, okay, great, you're putting a diverse skin on it, but it's still an ultimately reactionary story.
Right.
This is why I do, and Dave the Distributus noticed this in his event talk called "Do Leftists Leftoids Stream of Reactionary Sheep?" And the answer is basically yes, they do. And if you just change the aesthetics just a little bit to be a little more diverse, a little more green, a little more, tolerant, and it's going to be a little more peaceful. Like, it's the same thing. Is that it's still basically a reactionary story. It's they on deep down they still want. Unfortunately, they're still human, so they still want the same things. But of course, the mechanisms to get there are highly different.
Right, and
they just want
it's
power.
also they have to wrap it up in that because they can't acknowledge that they actually have those thoughts, that
Yeah.
they have those those impulses and instincts. It's like, if a person, has been like looking to modern day, it's like, I can't think those things. Oh my God, that's so intolerant of me to say or think these things. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And it's like, it's a mask to wear.
Yeah,
It's a Band-Aid.
I actually like, as much as I would disagree on Dave about other issues, he's not wrong. He's absolutely correct, and he is basically saying, and the woke are more correct than the mainstream, and yes, that is true, but they don't understand these things, and how do you get them to accept it? I'm not sure you can. Maybe you can, but you can't get them to accept it on
Our terms.
on our terms, which is a factual, informational level. You have to. They have to be told these things symbolically, almost like religiously as a meta-narrative, and that's how they understand it and will accept it.
So, again, as you said, you can't tell them directly. And is that just simply because of the state in which the infantile leftist mind, I forget who said it, is basically like, they want, because they're so high in the harm avoidance, that it goes not just to physical, but their own mental. They need to go and play with their Play-Doh and the puppies and glitter in the corner while, a conservative speaker comes to a college campus. They're just so mentally fragile that they just can't, have someone frankly tell something to their face. The defenses just go up and they screech like autistic children, or what?
I don't know. I don't want to get people of psychologists, leftists so much, and that's not really the focus of my channel.
We'll just go with liberalism as a mental disorder.
Sure.
Like Michael Savage used to say.
Sure. But these sorts of forms are fascinating to me because I almost view it as a tell. Like, this is basically my take that I had in my Dune video is because they used a lot of perennial symbology in Dune, and
yes,
and I said pagan symbology, but it's perennial basically. They arrive in multiple religions, and the Indo-European religions especially. But the things that it's very odd seeing the 2021 Dune movie. Yeah, okay, there's the diverse cast choices, and Timothy Chalamet's and Micheline, and so like you could imprint on him as a member of the cast and his character, pretty much whatever you want. So maybe I was imprinting a little much for my own desires, but I still found it very interesting that essentially they did have basically a racial hierarchy system in the universe, right? Which is that, okay, white people are basically at the top of the hierarchy. They're in all of the major leadership positions, right? For the most part, you do have occasional minority representation in other leadership spots as well. Like, for example, the Navigators had a black dude at the beginning.
But he wasn't a navigator. He was simply the Navigators were the ones with, I believe, the helms, the opaque helms, because the spice mutates navigators. They have to be constantly inundated with spice, so they're actually not. So they were lesser mutated, still human enough that they could go out and walk, but they had those suits on too.
Yeah, that's a nice touch. I didn't actually make that connection until you just said so right now. But yeah, the interesting thing about those particular casting choices is that you can see, and it's a way of explaining to them, right? Because it still has the diversity, but you're explaining to them this is their vision of the future, basically, right? Okay, you're going to still have white people in positions of power and authority and leadership, and you're going to have an underclass, right? This is like an ulterior Hollywood version of this, and I do wonder because like we've talked before about, and a lot of people have talked about the Soviet Union adopting in the obviously the rebranding of World War II into the Great Patriotic War, and utilizing the Russian traditional folk songs.
They couldn't motivate people with communist universalism.
Yes, but that's and especially we were talking yesterday off recording about Timoshenko and his bringing back of the marshal rank and bringing back military hierarchy to the Red Army.
Yes.
As well as Stalin actually having the United States give them gold thread so that they could have actual rank epaulets for their officer class.
Right.
Which are specialized and just differentiated, right? These are it doesn't seem like a big deal in World War II, but
it is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
It is a very big deal.
It is a tacit acceptance, and it is the turning of the wheel back to normal versions of hierarchy and order. Sure, it's a Soviet one, and it's the acceptance of, okay, the left-wing ratchet has moved far enough, and these forms of culture out of necessity have to be preserved, because otherwise
it'll all break down.
Yeah, we'll lose our power. So
right.
This is one of the weird observations that people have had about the USSR, is that it preserved in cultural stasis these more traditional elements of ethnic society.
Well, you're even seeing this in communist China, how once the Chinese Communist Party has achieved total power, it is now, it's even starting to, clamp down on feminism
too.
Yeah, it's getting incredibly ethnocentric. It's obviously, despite all of the projecting of their strength and all the shills that they have running around in various sources, they still have lots of internal trouble, but they are beginning to move away from the universalism, and they even say it now. Well, yes, we're communist, but with Chinese characteristics.
Yes.
Basically giving a giant middle finger to the tribe who helped them overthrow the prior government and get everything in.
Yeah.
So they're saying, no, we're not going to play this globalist universalist game. We're going to play it on our terms, and you've moved all your industry to us. So what are you going to do to us?
Yes, you can't just simply do the World War II strategy of using Western industry to dominate.
What we were talking about the last time? The industry's been gutted. We have to reindustrialize. That's the only hope, and that is going to be a long-term project.
Yeah, and that particular Anyway, that's a conversation on its own. The fascinating thing about I keep coming back to the as a hopeful vision, as reading signals in media, because that take that others have given, which is that the powers that be signal what they're thinking, what they're
always
in media sources. I take Dune, the 2021 movie, to be a very, very positive sign. It's small things, right? Very small concessions. But still,
it usually takes a decade. Like if you look at, we've been going back and watching these old movies, and you start to see it takes time for the ball to get rolling culturally. But the movies are one of the things that signal what's going to come.
Yeah,
in a very real sense.
I actually view like Dune and the Northman specifically, as the fact that the Northman was
Even got made.
in
Yes.
today's environment is a massive W in our column. And though it didn't perform well financially, and I have my reasons why I think that, which is basically I think that they did everything that they could in terms of preventing it from being shown in all theaters.
Oh yes, no, without a doubt. It's like what was it? You talked about what the studios did with the Kingdom of Heaven, and how they cut giant portions of it, and they did all kinds of things because they did not want a movie basically being glory to white Christian Western civilization.
Yes, or they didn't want it to be a movie that could be perceived that way.
Yes.
I think that's pretty much a good take, and people have problems with the director's cut version of Kingdom of Heaven, but and I haven't even watched the film yet. I probably should, but it's like 3.5 hours long, so it's on my to-do list. But
there's a lot of things they get wrong. But still, the fact it's one of those things of it's like, I'm kind of shocked they even made this.
Yeah, and it's still very, very dated. And like I said before, Kingdom of Heaven was made in the middle of Iraq and Afghanistan, like the War on Terror, and so there's the anti-Islam angle, and also the Crusaders are like kind of bad, and Islam is the good guy, which is obviously with the current powers
the typical leftist outgroup for the enemy against
typical Hollywood drivel basically.
Well, and that's part of the thing too is, and I remember this, it's like when they started doing the security at the airports and everything, it's like, okay, that 80-year-old white granny, she's not gonna, strap a bomb to her and, shout Allahu Akbar. We know who the enemy is, but we're not allowed to talk about it because that would be bigoted.
I mean, that was honestly one of the weirdest parts about the last part of the War on Terror. Like, it was the weirdest thing. And anyway,
well, it demonstrates, but like you talked about signaling, what did it actually signal? It was the government signaling, oh no, you all are the threat. Not this group of people here, out there. No. You all are the threat. And we've seen how, of course, the surveillance state has evolved. The NSA and everything has clearly demonstrated that it's more concerned with targeting its own people than it is with dealing with whatever external threat.
Right.
The Taliban was never going to come in. Saddam Hussein was never going to come here. Muammar Gaddafi was never going to come here. And even if they had dropped a bomb or two and, leveled half a city, they weren't going to destroy us.
Yeah.
The goal was the long term and the implementation over a period of, how many years now has it been? 22, 21 years now? 21 years has been the setup of the surveillance state that Joseph Stalin would go into orgasms over.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about the modern film context, right, is there are other signs too, like Midsommar is an interesting one in terms of like the changing flavor of films, like especially because obviously Midsommar has a lot of also pagan themes as well in a horror context, like paganism in terms of its symbology and like the basic themology is obviously because of the idea of the Odinic, which is a creative destroyer. There's an element of horror to it, and so the like obviously the hanged man, right? These are like there's a lot of horror and human sacrifice and animal sacrifice, just weird.
It's very alien to the modern
mind, which is not spiritual, which is essentially the core element and theme of Midsommar, right? The discomfort with nature, the desire to go into a more natural setting, which is very to go on a religious journey basically in a natural setting is something that lots of people do. The utilization of mind-altering chemicals to find the source of the divine. Yes, that's all stuff that happens. The interesting thing is that you can see from the character of Danny, the chick in the main character, the protagonist in Midsommar, is she's obviously like, and I mentioned this to you off recording, but she's wearing a very frumpy clothing, right? She's very dumpy looking. She's like very, oh, I look like a college feminist, right?
Minus the colored hair.
Yeah, and her clothes are very much, she's not unattractive, but the clothes make her less so, right? And that's a deliberate choice in this because it's making her look like, oh, I'm kind of low status, right? There's this inability to handle death and an inability in the modern secular mindset to handle passing on, and it's interesting because that's the initial, like, the thing that sparks her to go interested to Sweden in the film in the first place, to go to this Midsummer event. And the other interesting thing that you see from the trope is, like, you obviously have the diverse casting, and I found it interesting because from a modern liberal mindset of like, oh, well, this is a 100% ethnically Swedish, very blonde-haired, blue-eyed.
Yeah, that's the real horror element for the leftists.
Yes, that's an absolute, like, for them, that is, like, Midsommar for right-wingers isn't a horror, it's a comedy.
Yeah.
But, and I say that because, for left-wingers, it's a horror movie.
I'm gonna plant me a jogger tree. Oh, that's my terrible.
That's my favorite part of the movie, I swear. Yes,
Anyway.
It's like obviously and God damn it.
I'm sorry. No, after I said that, like, we were just laughing at the end. The moment I saw that and I said that line, we just can't take this seriously anymore.
And it happened like, because it happens like literally right after he has sex with the redhead chick. It's so funny because you're just like, God, this is ridiculous, man. This isn't a horror movie. This is just. But it's so interesting, right? Because you have the idea of interacting positively with nature, of like that these
your own community, your own culture.
Yes, that natural processes are not something that should necessarily be feared. They are a good thing, and to participate in them is not a shameful thing, right? And I'm not somebody who's super big into like communal sex or anything like those people were in the movie, but it's interesting. But
it's like with the what's the frumpy chicks, whatever her name is.
Oh, Danny, yeah.
Her reaction, stumbling in on that, and then there was that other group that followed her, and they didn't attack her, but they did that whole.
Yes.
Empathetic.
Yeah, group. Suffering, the female communal suffering. And it's very interesting because, like, you and I talked about this, because women have this tendency to do that, of I need to suffer with, the idea that you need to suffer with your girls, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's exactly what they're doing, right? They're having communal suffering. And this is this weird idea that everybody is part of a greater whole, and so if one individual is suffering, everybody also, like, at least partially partakes of the suffering as well. It's a very odd idea, and you hear it more in like military spheres a lot, with the idea, but it's more in terms of communal punishment. That if one person is failing in their responsibility, then everybody suffers.
Well, as in the military sense, though, it has to be that way. You're only as fast as the slowest man.
Yes.
One weak link in the chain will shatter it, and the chain will will be useless or cause catastrophic damage.
Correct.
And well, also too, one of the reasons it's an antithesis is because look at just the sheer atomization of society today. That is the other aspect, is we're all supposed to be individuals and doing our own thing. There is no, sense of community. You may have that with a church or some group of friends you get together with, but for the most part, there's no, you go out around town, I don't know these people. They don't give a shit about me.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is that the desire for community is, like, this is also the horrifying thing for liberals because, how close are we?
We're an hour 10.
Oh, okay, yeah, we can keep going as long as you got time.
Keep going. We're
Yeah, so
community as far as liberals.
Yeah, as far as liberals go, is that this is a horror movie to them because they are slowly realizing that they are part of a group. They want to be part of some group, and they're realizing that, even if the spiritual traditions are nonsensical and not logical, they still want to scientifically study it, right? And they can,
or in some cases, be part of it.
Yes, or and the case in Danny's case, she absolutely wants.
She reveled in it.
Yeah, she reveled in it. She enjoyed herself in her little maypole dance, and we talked about this on a psychological level. What is this doing to her, right? Before, in secular Western liberal culture, where she's in the academy, she is not a high status woman, whereas in the maypole dance, she actually wins the maypole dance dancing competition and becomes the maypole queen, right? So now she is in a position of reverence and respect. She gets to sit at the head of the table, right? For someone like her, this is incredible. And also, she wants this, she enjoys that, and this is the realization that white liberals, I think, are slowly, very ever so slowly coming to, is that no, regardless of what you think, you are still part of a group. You are treated as if you're part of a group, no matter what.
Yes.
So instead of constantly counter-signaling and betraying your in-group, if you want community, if you want acceptance and validation,
and have a place,
then you need to actually accept what being part of that group entails. So, and the other thing that I found interesting about it too is Danny's, obviously there's the positive aspect of death and the shocking horror of it in these strange practices. In the movie, they don't actually show human sacrifice, but they show people committing a ritual form of suicide in, the appointed time of old age. And of course, their elders, before they do this act of ritual suicide, they are revered, they are, given a special place and respected and given peace, etc. So these are fascinating. And of course, obviously the blood magic in terms of blooding the runes and stuff, which is a form of Nordic blood magic. Mm-hmm. I'm not super up to speed on that, but I know that exists. So it's fascinating to see these sorts of cultural practices represented, and to see that, my big take from that was they want it. Despite themselves, they want this. That's what they want. And also there is this acceptance also on Danny's part, right? It's very amorally presented, right? What the fate of her boyfriend is. Danny's boyfriend and her friends, all of her multiracial friends, basically to become part of this community, she has to be separated from her multiracial friends, right?
Yes.
She cannot be part of them She cannot be with her like shitlib, like normie-con style friend. She can't be with her boyfriend, and the acceptance of his fate, right? Which is, of course, she achieves vengeance by choosing him for the ritual, because he obviously had sex with the redhead girl and gets her pregnant. And so she's very angered by this, but she's able to achieve her vengeance, and the community just basically goes,
Okay, welcome aboard.
yeah, basically, we needed another sacrificial victim anyway. Well, I guess I should have stated that they do depict human sacrifice at the end, but that's the central premise of the horror of the movie, right? But it's very interesting to see that, like, she wants this, she wants it, and I think that this is actually very fertile ground, and it's really showing, because in horror movies, you show the truth in a way that cannot be said in normal polite society, and that's what Midsommar is displaying, is the
and
liberal.
you've said many a time that horror movies are often have had that kind of subliminal thing to them. Again, I'm not a horror fan at all. I get the heebie-jeebies for horror movies. I can watch violence all day, but for some reason, just horror just tickles me the wrong way. But yeah, well, and again, as I said, dreaming of reactionary sheep, looking at the popularity, especially the resurging popularity of things like BattleTech. Look at how Warhammer 40k is continuing to grow. Warhammer 40k, as Sargon and others have mentioned and talked about, it is very reactionary.
They're doing their best.
Yeah, they're doing their best to pause it. Pause,
Yeah.
as in, that sense, not pause as in freeze.
Right.
But at the same time, if they do that and they succeed, it's going to collapse.
Yeah, it is so reactionary that to make it non-reactionary would destroy it.
Yes.
So that's that. But I mean, it's interesting.
It's how to kill a franchise. I mean, look at what they've done to Star Wars.
Yeah, but it's also very, like, and this is my great hope, right, with these media sources that I'm discussing, is that this is a glimpse of which way the world is turning. Okay, we've had enough of the racial politics of a movie like Get Out, or like. We've had enough of the explicit racial identity. You're being exploitative to the white population, basically, and you need to stop signaling you are a member of a group. Stop signaling that you're not a part of this group, and counter signaling at every turn. And you want to return in any case anyway. Despite yourself, so it's interesting to me, because this is what these three movies, which is Dune, The Northman, and Midsommar, represent. And
right, and to the people watching them who maybe are not noticing that, what they are going to increasingly notice is that as the regime maybe is behind on some of these narrative signalings, it's going to continue to push, for an acceleration of what is already underway. So all of these people, if they go join a company, they go work for the government, etc., like our previous roommate working for the environmental agency, is like, if there's some diversity hire, they're going to be promoted over you. It's like in the military, they're promoting officers based on their gender and their ethnicity, not on their competence. And there's the exodus of the...
Yeah, and increasingly, as the social pressure to do that increases, they are going to find, in order to reach their diversity quotas, they will push out or disenfranchise some very high-performing, powerful people, and that is what we need to use to form a counter-elite. And if that happens to them where they get pushed out for diversity reasons or something, that's an easy sell to them.
Oh yes.
Assuming that these people can survive and despite pressure be able to thrive.
It's the question: will that be the red pill to wake them up, or will they have to?
Oh yes, definitely. That is the first start of where you get questions, right? Like the problem with
I've done everything you asked me. I've loyally served, and I've done all that I could to back you and obey all your tenets.
Right.
And you still pushed me aside and grabbed someone behind me and pulled them forward instead.
Over the long term, there's going to be a segment of that population which does that sort of thing happens to them, and they question. Some of them aren't. I think a smaller percentage of those who have that happen to them aren't going to question.
There will always be that segment that will simply bow their heads and accept whatever is done to them.
There are always sheep, right? And the issue that we've mentioned before and has been mentioned by others before is that, well, look, the trans thing is a status hack for a straight white male in a progressive institution.
Right.
And the same thing goes for women and non-binary, right? If you notice how many women say that they're bisexual or that they claim non-binary status.
As Tucker Carlson said, all women are bi. It's a question where they're bisexual or bipolar.
Oh man. I love Tucker. This is the status hack, right? And what is happening is that people are not quite ready. There's not an alternative that people can flee to yet, right. And so there are
at least not openly and publicly.
Yes, and so the cynical people who feel that they have no other option, just do whatever the regime wants them to do. They become trans. They encourage their kid to become trans.
Well, it's also especially like you see these women pushing and saying, "Oh yes, my son's trans." It's using your child as a prop to virtue signal.
Yeah, it's Munchausen syndrome by proxy, as we well know. But the status hack thing is the most important part, because this is an extremely clever thing that the regime has actually done, and it's not just a financial grift for the pharmacological sector,
right. The medical
industrial complex. It's very good at
it's channeling people's natural desire to attain status in the hierarchy
into something that is destructive for them personally. And so over time, yes, these people. And of course, it creates a janissary class out of your children.
Deploy the Tranissaries.
So over time, these individuals, though they will exist, will eventually they will not be able to breed, right? And they will acquire power. They'll do their thing.
But they'll be like the eunuchs in China.
Yes, but eventually, like, there is going to come a point where either they won't be able to proselytize as much as they would like, because people are now understanding what's going on, or the number of, if assuming that we can get white people to have babies, they will be outnumbered by conservatives over the long term.
Yes.
In and amongst the white population itself. So,
but what they will do is they will simply conform like they did before. They'll change their caps, their colors, and they'll go along with whatever, overriding narrative and system is giving them orders. And that's what sheep do. You know,
Yes.
the ruling elite comes in, makes a
well,
declaration, the NPC chip comes out, and they slap in a new one.
That's the thing, though. The South Africanization is interesting because, and we're getting very far afield here. So, I think this is probably the last thing I want to talk about.
Okay.
But there's still always going to be the hardcore, true believing
Yes.
leftoid person who is, no matter what, as long as they receive a cushy sinecure position with the regime where they don't actually have to do any real work other than activism stuff, once in a blue moon, they will continue to back the
Right.
regime, even if all of their racial compatriots are disenfranchised totally.
Yes.
There will
Well,
be
because
no
they're in it for themselves.
Yes.
You know, they profess to care about everyone when in fact they're malignant narcissists.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it's funny because I literally just watched the Punch and Judy talk that Bowden gave, and he was saying, in this talk, there's the devil, and these little plays, they would say, the first Whig was the devil, basically. So I found that interesting because that's, liberalism as I betray my group or I betray order in order to foster my own sense of self-worth.
Yes.
So,
Well, isn't I forget who the author is. He talks about the five values or whatever, and how, I forget what his name is. But how conservatives have the five relatively balanced, but the leftist has the two in excess.
You're talking about Jonathan Haidt's book.
Yeah.
The six moral foundations. Yeah, conservatives have all of them, and the leftists only have three, which means that when the left makes its appeals, which are always based off of the same formula of help, I'm being hurt, I'm oppressed,
Yeah.
it's all so unfair, right? Every single left-wing argument always boils down to that essential formula. And because conservatives have those three moral foundations as well, they are able to
Subvert, co-opt, infiltrate.
They'll just use the wedge tactic of the I'm hurting. You need to do things to make me feel good, basically, or you need to do things in order to alleviate my suffering.
Right.
Right.
But the problem is because they only have those three, the system starts to fall apart, and they need conservative people
and
to keep the system running.
Yeah, and AA on Cigar Stream this week basically said as much to Mike from Imperium Press. He was just like, look, if the right is allowed to do anything, if they're allowed full voice, they can speak to more people and to more moral values and gain a much wider base of support. And so this idea...
Yeah, well, that's why they have to be silenced. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. It's why the censorship that's why they have to go in and censor the internet.
Yeah, and it's partially why AA thinks that elections are not always going to be 50-50. Like, it's very odd, and he's correct about this, that you don't see landslide elections anymore. And it's...
Fortification.
Yes, yeah, and as much as people like to blame demographics, I think fortification might be a bigger factor.
Well, I mean, you did have stuff like the Battle of Athens.
Yes.
You know.
Well, I mean, that's literally just like... Dankula's video on that was really good too, because he's just like, oh, well, you have these commies who come in, and yes, they are commies, and you can tell they're commies because the first thing they do is, oh, look, we're going to have prostitution, we're going to have, we're
going to destroy the family,
ethics.
Destroy the community, destroy
and
ethics, standards,
and not punish criminals, and of course, when people complain, they'll use all of these things in order to be worse.
The typical buzzwords, even for go back all the way to then.
And this is just the Alinsky tactics too, right? Because people mistake, well, these tactics don't work. Well, yes, they do, because they're destructive. They are deliberately deployed in order to push out opponents and to get people to leave a certain geographical area so that that area can be controlled.
Displacement is a classic strategy for takeover.
Yes.
You simply make the conditions so intolerable that people, rather than
Willingly.
fight back, they willingly pick up and leave.
Move. Yes.
Yes.
Anyway, I think that's pretty much it of what I want to talk about.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. All right.
Yeah, that's it.
If you liked this video, please like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and be sure to check out findmyfriends.net to follow me in all of the places where I am present online, including my Substack account, where I am very prolific in writing.